Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ville Sinkkonen. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center on US Politics and Power, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's Transatlantic Currents webinar, which is entitled Russia's War on Ukraine and US Policy. Now, I'll soon yield the floor to our own non-resident fellow, Leo Michel, who will chair today's session and introduce our speaker, Ambassador William Taylor. Given Ambassador Taylor's experience and his expertise, I can't think of a better speaker to address the past, present, and future of US policies towards Russia, Ukraine, and the European theater in general. Now, before we go on, a few minor notes on housekeeping. Ambassador Taylor and Leo will have a discussion for approximately 25 minutes. After that, I'll open the floor to the audience Q&A. But you can begin typing your questions and reflections in the chat box during the presentation, and I'll curate the QA portion of the discussion, provide the questions. And if you please could also state your name and affiliation in conjunction with your question. Without further ado then, I'll hand over the floor to Leo, and he will introduce Ambassador Taylor. I wish you a pleasant webinar.
Thank you, Ville, and hello from Washington. Ambassador Taylor, we are delighted to have you with us today, and for several reasons. You have had extensive experience with the design and implementation of US policy on Ukraine. As US ambassador there from 2006 to 2009, under Presidents Bush and Obama. During the last half of 2019, you were called out of retirement to serve as the chargé d'affaires to Ukraine and famously opposed President Trump's decision to withhold military aid to Ukraine to help with his political campaign. And since last spring, you have individually and in collaboration with other distinguished former diplomats and national security officials been a consistent advocate for additional US and European military, economic, diplomatic, and humanitarian support for Ukraine. To begin our discussion, though, would you first say a few words about the US Institute for Peace, where you currently serve as vice president for Russia and Europe, since some in our audience might not be familiar with this unique institution?
Leo, thank you. I'd be glad to do that. Let me first just thank you and the Institute for having me here today. It's an honor to be able to speak to you and all the people that have tuned in to this webinar. As Leo, as you and I both know, the Americans, the United States is very, very pleased about the Finnish accession into NATO. It will strengthen NATO, as we know. It will reinforce what NATO can do in support of Ukraine, and we're going to be talking about that here today. I noticed that the Finnish Prime Minister in New Zealand today was talking about the strong support for Finland of Ukraine and how Ukraine has to win. And there will be time for soft power. And she made the point that hard power is what's called for right now. So I'm just very pleased to be able to talk to Finns today and look forward to the questions as you've indicated. So just a brief word on the United States Institute of Peace. It's an unusual organization here in Washington. That is, it was created by the Congress, funded by the Congress. It's not technically, legally part of the administration of any administration, Biden administration in this case, but we work very closely with the State Department. We are located right across the street, 23rd Street from State Department. We work very closely, and the kind of things we've done, Leo, in the past, just on the Ukraine topic, we've been able, during the time between 2014 and 2022, there were efforts, as we all know, in the Minsk group, ill-fated and failed Minsk group, Minsk agreements. But there were times when we and the State Department thought that there might be a way to get the Russians out of Donbass in some negotiated way. So as an example of the kind of thing the Institute of Peace did, we pulled together senior Ukrainians, former officials, former ministers of foreign affairs, former ministers of defense, with senior Russians and senior Americans. And we got together in Europe, excuse me, and had a couple of days of serious conversation, morning, noon, and night, dinners and smoke breaks and conversations. And we made some progress. So much progress that we got together again and came up with a document that we all took back to our various governments. We came back to Washington, provided this information to them. The Ukrainians did the same, the Russians did the same. Excuse me. So the kind of things that we do are in support of U.S. foreign policy, but we can be, a separate voice, and so that's the kind of thing we got offices all over the world. We've got excuse me, an office in Islamabad. We had a big program in Afghanistan. Don't now. We have a big office in Baghdad. We do some work on China. So it's a range of things. We are designed to look for conflict resolution. I'm going to take a quick step here.
No problem, Ambassador.
Thank you, Leo. So the Congress established us to look for ways to resolve conflict, violent conflict abroad. So that's the kind of thing we do.
Good. Well, look, moving specifically to Ukraine, I'd like to start by asking for your net assessment, if you will, of the current situation. Can the Ukrainians maintain their recent momentum on the battlefield while Russia continues its massive air attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure and other civilian targets?
I think the short answer is yes. I think the Ukrainians can maintain that momentum on the battlefield. As you say, they have been winning on the battlefield. They are winning on the battlefield. They won in the Battle of Kyiv, and the Battle of Kharkiv, and the Battle of Kherson. And they tell me, they tell us that they're going to continue that push. They're going to continue that counteroffensive that has put the Russians on the defensive and put the Ukrainians on the offensive. And they've got the momentum. So the Russians have only one thing that they can do, and that's bombard civilian targets. Civilian targets, in particular, the electricity grid that makes it difficult, makes it horrible to live in Ukraine at this point. I have friends, we all have friends, probably people on this call have friends in Kyiv and around the country of Ukraine. And as people know, there's many people who live in high-rise apartments. Just as an example, I have good friends. One's on the 17th floor, and another's on the 25th floor of high-rise apartments. With no electricity, there is no water going up into those apartments. So you walk down 17 flights, fill up with water because the electricity drives the water pumps. Electricity also drives the elevators. And so people have to walk down, fill up, walk back up, just in order to have water. And that's just one example, Leo, of the kinds of things that the Russians are inflicting on the Ukrainians. And the Russians, of course, want to try to break the Ukrainians, and they are failing. The Russians are failing to break the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are ever more angry at the Russians, ever more determined to win this war. And again, the Finnish Prime Minister made this point today that Ukraine can win. We need to support them. We need to support the Ukrainians. And this gets to the second part of your question about how we can support the Ukrainians, both on providing weapons, which we are doing. I just heard yesterday that the United States government has finally decided to provide Patriot missiles, anti-aircraft, anti-missile defense. The best that we've got. The Patriot weapons are very, very good at knocking down incoming missiles. And we're now going to provide them to the Ukrainians. It's about time. We should have done that earlier. But that's a good sign. And other NATO nations are doing the same, including Finland. Finland has provided 10 packages of weapons, which is really important. It's really important and appreciated, certainly by the Ukrainians and by the rest of NATO. There's another part Leo, that you point, and that is how to help the Ukrainians get through this winter.
Yeah.
And again, the international community has come together. Just yesterday, they got together in Paris and committed to providing more than $1 billion worth of assistance to the Ukrainians to help them get through the winter, to repair the electricity, to repair the water, to provide the heat. This is going to be very important going forward. And again, the Ukrainians are not succumbing to this pressure. They are determined to win this war, and we need to help them.
Well, you wrote actually with the co-author in the Washington Post just last week, calling for the U.S. to organize and lead a major public and private international humanitarian effort to help the Ukrainians make it through the winter. And you compared this to the Berlin airlift, in 1948, 1949. You also noted that, to quote from your article, U.S. military escorts may be necessary to open the path for civilian humanitarian assistance, because this could be shipped or would be shipped by rail, road, sea, but also air. So let me just ask you to elaborate a little bit on how the initiative that you proposed would fit in with these other efforts that we've recently seen announced by the G7 or yesterday's Paris conference on Ukraine, to pledge more and better coordinated near-term aid to Ukraine. And do you see any role for the UN here? Would a UN mandate, United Nations mandate of some sort, be necessary or helpful? For example, a UN General Assembly resolution that would invoke what's known as the responsibility to protect principle that was adopted by the UN in 2005.
Leo, a bunch of good questions, a bunch of very good questions. So yes, the proposal that David Kramer and I made was to mount a major effort. And again, we suggested this last week, and we're very glad to see that a major effort is now underway, as you say, in Paris yesterday. So that's a very good sign. It needs to be coordinated. It needs to be broad. And this gets to the second part of your question. That is, as you say, it needs to go by rail, by truck, by ship, and if necessary, in some cases, by air. Now, air is difficult right now, as we know. Right now, the airports in Ukraine are closed. And they're closed because the Russians threaten any aircraft that comes into that airspace. Nonetheless, we're talking about here humanitarian deliveries. Most of the humanitarian assistance that we're talking about should be done by ground and sea. That's going to be more efficient. And as we know, a lot of supplies, military and other kinds of supplies, humanitarian, are now going into Ukraine at a rapid pace. They are going by rail, by truck. And so this is ongoing, and that should continue. But if there are reasons that the international community, this big effort, international effort, sees to be able to provide in aircraft the kinds of equipment or supplies that for some reason needs to go in quickly, needs to go into these airfields, then that may be necessary for NATO aircraft to provide some protection. Humanitarian airlift, humanitarian aircraft, military aircraft on humanitarian missions. We would let everybody know. The Russians, obviously the Ukrainians, would be coordinating very closely. So everybody would know what we're doing. We would let people know where we're flying, what we have on board. If people want, if somebody, the UN OSCE, wants to take a look at what's being loaded into these trucks or into these aircraft, fine. Great transparency. We want to get humanitarian supplies into Ukrainians so they can make it through this winter. What the Russians are doing now, Leo, in my view, is clearly a war crime. These are clearly war crimes. These are atrocities. These are actions of a genocidal regime. And this gets to your point about the UN and the responsibility to protect. There are several responsibilities in international law. One is the responsibility to protect civilians. Another is the responsibility that every UN member signed up for in the Genocide Convention. If there is genocide or threat of genocide, nations are obligated to try to stop it. And in my view, in the view of smarter people than I am on the legal aspects of this and the humanitarian aspects of this, this is genocide. What the Russians are doing against the Ukrainians meets the definition of genocide according to the Genocide Convention. So there's an obligation as well. You asked the question about the broader UN response. Obviously, the Security Council is frozen, is inoperative because the Russians veto anything there. But the General Assembly has passed several resolutions, 143 to 5. So over and over, they've been overwhelmingly voting against the Russians in support of the Ukrainians. And that could well provide the ground, the legal ground, the political ground for these humanitarian deliveries. So that, yes, it could be, if we could use the General Assembly to provide that kind of cover, that's a good idea. We need to protect the Ukrainians. We need to allow the Ukrainians to get through this winter.
In the to pursue a little bit what you mentioned also about military support, in November, you joined a group of other, once again, very prominent former officials in a statement that urged the United States and the Allies to accelerate their military support for the overall, what you call the overall Ukrainian campaign plan. In that group, in that statement, the group specified that Washington should not be self-deterred by Russian nuclear threats. And you added there, and it was very interesting, quote, the Ukrainians are justified in using their weapons, including those received from Western partners, to attack any Russian forces that attack them, wherever those attacking Russian forces are located, unquote. And I think we all understand the possible implications of that, but how do you, you've been working on this for so long, how do you evaluate the risk that such attacks could result in further, even more dangerous escalation by the Russian side?
So, Leo, what we recommended there, in our view, is common sense. It's militarily justified. If the Russians have units, military units, that fire on Ukrainian targets in Ukraine, military or civilian, if the Russians fire at Ukrainians, then the Ukrainians ought to be able to fire back. This is what we've proposed. This is what we've suggested. And Ukrainians have done that. The Ukrainians have fired back at military targets, both in Russia, obviously in occupied Ukraine, and in Crimea, which, as we know, is Ukrainian territory. So the Ukrainians have used that military justification to fire back at the units that are firing at them. Now, you ask about escalation.
Yeah.
And it's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate question. We have seen, however, that the Russians have not escalated. We have seen how the Russians have said over and over, don't do this or we'll escalate. And they haven't. They have said, for example, don't provide weapons to the Ukrainians or we'll escalate. Or they've said, don't provide long-range weapons to the Ukrainians or we'll escalate. Or they've said, we'll conduct referenda in these 4 oblasts of Ukraine. And after the referenda, we will annex them. We will take those fake referenda, the results of the referenda, and we will annex them and treat them as Russian territory. And if there's any Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory, we'll use everything available to us. You know, we know what they mean. And the very next day, the Ukrainians pushed the Russians out of Kherson which was one of the oblasts that they say is Russian territory. And what happened? Nothing. This is not to say that they will never escalate. This is to say that they've been bluffing so far. They've been bluffing so far. And the Ukrainians, to their credit, have called their bluff every time and continue to push the Russians out of their country. That's what we're talking about doing. We're talking about a military effort against military targets to push the Russian military out of Ukraine. That's what the Ukrainians are after. Just get the Russian military out of their country, include all of their country. So yes, we should not allow ourselves to be self-deterred and somehow pull our punches and somehow not provide the Ukrainians the kinds of weapons that they need and the kinds of authorities that they need. There are a couple of good signs over the last couple of days. I've already mentioned the provision of the Patriots. That's a very good sign. And that's a more powerful, longer range, more capable weapon than we provided in the past. And it demonstrates that the U.S. government, that the Biden administration has gone up the ladder. We started off with Stingers and now we're at Patriots. You know, that's a pretty large increase in capability, and that should continue. We ought to be able to continue to do that. So we should not deter ourselves from providing the kinds of weapons that the Ukrainians need, in particular this air defense. I mean, it's you know, the attacks, the Russian attacks on civilian targets, the electrical generation and distribution network, the grid, to make it as miserable as possible for the Ukrainians this winter. We should give the Ukrainians every air defense capability that they ask for. And I'm glad that we're doing Patriots. We need to do more. We do it at several layers, both the short range, medium range, long range. We help the Ukrainians. We ought to give the Ukrainians what they need to knock down the drones, knock down the cruise missiles, knock down the ballistic missiles, knock down the aircraft that are firing on them. Yes, we should provide that, and we should not be deterred.
So I'm sure there are questions coming in on the chat, and I want to save time for that. So let me just put together 2 or 3 questions all in one, but they all relate to this important question of possible future negotiations. And here we're really appealing to your diplomatic expertise here. So in the past, and you mentioned this in passing, that there have been various multilateral groupings such as the Minsk group. There's also been the Normandy format that have been used, unfortunately with little success, to find some negotiated settlement of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So what lessons from those experiences have been learned for possible future negotiations? But I want to link that, once again, going back to this November statement that you joined or co-authored with other prominent Americans. It specifically recommended, that group specifically recommended that President Zelensky and the West should reject Russian ceasefire proposals that would lock in, I think your words were, lock in Russian territorial gains. And you also argued that sanctions should not be lifted until Russian forces withdraw from Ukraine's territory and Russia pays compensation for the damage caused by its invasion, which I gather compensation would come, at least in part, from some of the frozen Russian assets that are now held in Western countries. So it's perhaps unfair, but if you were able to put those policy recommendations directly to President Biden, how would you argue for them? Do you think that the U.S. also could win transatlantic support for such a robust approach?
I do, Leo. I think that the international community, starting, of course, with the NATO coalition, but expanded to the rest of Europe, and our East Asian allies, Japanese, South Koreans, New Zealand, Australia, where the Finnish prime minister is right now, all of that coalition, that broad coalition that, frankly, the Biden administration deserves credit for putting together and keeping together, has stuck together on the sanctions policy. We can come back to that question about sanctions in any negotiation as well. But the sanctions policy is held, indeed has expanded. the sanctions that broad coalition, broad Western democratic by and large coalition has the sanctions that coalition have put on the Russians, second to none. There have been no stronger sanctions put on any nation in history than those, and it goes to exactly what you just said. The Russian central bank has about $300 billion in in G7 banks. And that $300 billion could go a long way toward reconstructing Ukraine after the war. You know, the Ukrainians they don't say after the war, they say after the victory. So after the victory, there's going to be reconstruction, and it's going to be paid for somehow. Of course, the Ukrainians are paying the price right now. The international community is helping, but the Russians should pay. The Russians should pay, and that $300 billion is sitting frozen, as you've indicated, Leo, in G7 banks, and it's going to take some good lawyers and probably some legislation to be able to grab that money, to seize that money. It's frozen, but it now needs to go into an international fund, an international administered fund that will support both the Ukrainian government right now, day to day, just paying soldiers and paying healthcare workers, but also going into reconstruction over the longer term. And that 300 billion of Russian money can go a long way. Now, let me get back to your question about negotiations, because there have been a lot of proposals that the Ukrainians negotiate with the Russians. It's very interesting. None of those proposals have come from Ukrainians. It's very interesting that these proposals come from mostly outside of governments, but there have been a couple of governments who have been tempted to go into this mistake and recommend that the Ukrainians negotiate with the Russians. And what they talk about is, you know, it's compromise. We negotiate, and the Ukrainians would be pushed to compromise. And some people will say, you know, maybe the Ukrainians should give up claim to Ukrainian territory. Maybe that's the compromise that is needed in order to appease the Russians. And I think that's wrong. And my colleagues that signed on to that statement, and most, including the Biden administration, most people agree that now is not the time for the Ukrainians to negotiate. And now it's clearly not the time for any outsider, be it American or French, or governmental or non-governmental. Now's not the time to push the Ukrainians to negotiate, to compromise. Why? Because the Russians would get at a ceasefire, they would stop where they are. They right now illegally occupy 15% of Ukrainian territory. And that occupation is horrible. We know this. This goes back to genocide. We know it's horrible because every time the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out, have what the Ukrainians say deoccupied. Once the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out of the area north of Kyiv, Bucha, Irpin, or Kharkiv, or Izum, or Liman, or Kherson. Every time the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out and have gone back into those deoccupied cities, towns, villages, they find atrocities. They find mass graves. They find torture chambers. They find rapes. They find abductions. The Russians have grabbed Ukrainian children and taken them into Russia. This is just war crime. This is genocide. It's horrible. And what these people who are suggesting negotiations are saying is that the Ukrainians should allow the Russians to keep occupying that part of Ukraine that they are in, that 15%, where we know what happens. We know what happens in those occupied territories. And it's horrible. And the Ukrainians won't buy it. They will not. They'll continue to fight. They are continuing to fight. And I go back to this point, we need to continue to support them as they fight. There will come a time, Leo, when there will be some talk, some discussion, some negotiations. But that time will come when the Russians are out of the Ukrainian territory. When the Russians are out of Ukraine, then Zelensky has said he'd be willing to talk. You mentioned reparations. We've already talked about reparations, where that 300 billion could be a good start. We've talked about accountability. We talked about accountability, a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. There's no doubt in anyone's mind. You can even see it in the UN General Assembly resolutions that you mentioned earlier. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that this is the crime, that the Russians are guilty of the crime of aggression, the mother of all crimes. So someone needs to be held accountable. And as part of this discussion at the end of the war, after the victory, after the Russians are out of the country, there's going to have to be accountability, and people who are responsible for those war crimes, and that crime of aggression, and those atrocities and genocide will have to be held accountable. And that can be discussed in these negotiations, but the negotiations have to be at the Ukrainians' initiative and when the Russians are out of their country.
Thank you. Ambassador, personally, I would have a lot of questions left, but at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Ville, who's been capturing some from our webinar audience here. Thank you very much, and I'll come back at the end of the program just to thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Leo.
Thank you so much, Leo and Ambassador Taylor, for this most interesting discussion. A lot of food for thought. There's a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm going to put a bit of a twist to them in my role as moderator, I guess. So the first question is tied to how you see the US policy on Ukraine developing in the coming months. But I'd like you to take it a bit further, and you know, I know there's a part of it is speculation, but of course, you know, the presidential election is already approaching. We're past the midterms, so the presidential election is really just around the corner. So could you assess the implications of this, the two potential scenarios? So a Democratic administration, whether it's a Biden administration or whether somebody else will run, of course, we don't know that yet. And then the alternative of a Republican administration. So how would that play into the evolution of the US policy? And I think we can start with that, and I'll come back to the second question after.
It's a very good question, and I'm going to give you an answer that you probably didn't expect. Because I predict that in either case, no matter whether there's a Republican administration in 2025, after the election in 2024, or a Democratic administration in 2025, after the election, the policy will be the same. U.S. support for Ukraine does not depend on who's sitting in the White House. Now, it is true that the previous President Trump, was not supportive of Ukraine and was a little bit chummy with the Russians. Nonetheless, the next Republican administration will reflect Republican views. The next presidential administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, will reflect American views. American views are very clear. American support for Ukraine has been constant. It's varied up and down, of course, but it's been a majority support. For the last 9 months, really, it's been overwhelming. It has been broad, overwhelming support for every one of these very large assistance packages. You know, we're coming up on $100 billion of all kinds of assistance. We're coming up on $20 billion of military assistance, of weapons. That's serious support. Let me just say that $20 billion on military support is less than 3% of our defense budget. Let's just be clear. That 20 billion that we're providing, which is unprecedented support of weapons and military support to the Ukrainians, that's less than 3% of our overall defense budget. And that is a great investment. The Ukrainians are fighting the Russians on our behalf, on Finland's behalf, on Europe's behalf. And they are defeating the Russians, and they are demilitarizing the Russians. Their damage to the Russian military is extraordinary, and that is a great investment by the United States at less than 3% of our defense budget, not to mention our overall budget or our overall GDP. But less than 3% of our defense goes to the Ukrainians, and they're fighting for our values, and they're fighting for our security. So that's I think, a very important piece. And that broad support, that broad bipartisan support, I predict will continue. It has continued now. Even in these past elections, we see that. In the elections coming up, I predict that the Americans will be very clear about their support for Ukraine. And so it won't matter who's in the White House in 2025.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. That's certainly a more positive reading than one often hears, which is, of course, good to keep in mind that you know there's different dynamics that drive different political dynamics that drive the decision making of the White House, and it's not just, you know, the president's personal inclinations, etc. We're gonna zoom in first and then zoom out. So the next question has to do with the role of Poland and the other Central and East European countries in setting up the policy towards Russia. So I assume that, you know, your reflections on what kind of role Poland and the other Central and East European states have played over the course of this current phase of the conflict in Ukraine.
So Poland, the Baltic states, other East European states that are right on the border of Ukraine. So we're talking about Romania, we're talking about Slovakia. You've already mentioned Poland. So these states, these NATO members, have been very clear in their support for Ukraine and their opposition to Russia. Why? They feel it more than anyone. People in that geography, that corridor, that East European corridor, starting with the Baltic states and soon starting with Finland, and going down that border of Ukraine, they're on the front line. They're on the front line with the Russians if the Russians were to be able to take over Ukraine. I don't think they will. I don't think the Russians will be able to do that, because I think the Ukrainians will continue to fight and will win in the end, just like the Finnish Prime Minister said today. The Ukrainians will win with our support, and that will increase the security of that East European corridor. It'll increase the security of NATO. It'll increase the security of the Western members of the West European members of NATO. It'll increase the security of the United States and Canada. And so this, I think the Eastern Corridor NATO members, soon to include Finland, will be very important in that debate. It will be very important in the discussion and the tactics, the strategy, the logistical support for Ukraine. And so I am very pleased that to see that kind of strong support.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. So I mentioned zoom out. So the next question has to do with the role of China in all of this. So perhaps you could assess China's position so far, and then maybe look ahead a bit on how you see Beijing playing out its role in the future in the context of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah. No, you're right. And the questioner is right. The role of China is very interesting. just before the invasion, this latest invasion, as we know, the first invasion was in 2014. But just before the February 2022 invasion, President Putin visits Beijing, visits President Xi, just the Beijing Olympics. And the two presidents come out with this long statement talking about their partnership that has no limits, it says. And yet it turns out they did have limits. Turns out there were limits that the Chinese placed on this, because 3 weeks later, when the Russians invaded Ukraine again, massively, the Chinese were not pleased. The Chinese have made that displeasure clear over and over and over. They have, in the Security Council votes, Chinese have not supported the Russians. If that's unlimited partnership, there's some limits there. The Chinese have not supported the Russians in the Security Council. It was 11-1 in the Security Council, and the Chinese abstained. When they took it to the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, the vote was 143-5. And the Chinese were not in that 5. The Chinese again abstained. So the Chinese have not supported the Ukrainians, number one, and politically, diplomatically. Number two, economically, the Russians have gone to the Chinese and asked the Chinese for help getting around these sanctions. And the Chinese have said no. The Chinese have not evaded the sanctions to benefit the Russians. The Chinese know that if they evade the sanctions and provide some of these, for example, electronic equipment and electronic components and microchips that the Russians need to manufacture their precision-guided munitions, if the Chinese provide those in violation of the embargo and the sanctions, they'll be sanctioned. And the Chinese don't want that. So the Chinese have been abiding by these. Now, the Chinese have been buying cheap Russian oil. So have the Indians. But no one, the Chinese have not been providing these weapons or even the components of weapons. And number three, the Chinese have not provided finance for them. The Chinese have not provided weapons, finance, sanctions relief. So the Chinese, you asked me kind of where they are, they're not so pleased. One other thing that they've done recently, they've made it clear that all this loose, irresponsible talk coming from the Russians about nuclear weapons is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to Chinese. It's unacceptable to us, the United States. It's unacceptable to Europeans. It's unacceptable to the Indians. But it's unacceptable to the Chinese. And the Chinese have made it clear that's the case. They say that no one should be talking about nuclear weapons use. No one. So it's a very interesting question about the Chinese. Now, you asked about the future. I think that the Chinese are learning a lot from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They are learning that the international community, the Western alliance, led by the United States, is much stronger than they thought. I'm sure President Putin is surprised by that, but I imagine President Xi is surprised by that as well. To see the strength of and the resilience of and the determination of that alliance, that broad coalition against Russia in support of Ukraine, that's got to give President Xi pause. And I'm sure it is. Both President Xi and President Putin probably thought that the United States didn't have the stomach to support it. And they've learned. President Putin has learned. The Americans do have the stomach. The Europeans do have the stomach. And the Ukrainians in the lead have the stomach and the determination to win this war. So the Chinese are noticing that. The Chinese are probably asking themselves, whoa, I wonder how strong the Taiwanese are, because the Ukrainians are much stronger than anybody thought. Maybe the Taiwanese are much stronger than people thought. They also, President Xi is probably also asking himself, you know, I hope my military, my Chinese military, People's Liberation Army, is as strong as I think they are. because President Putin thought his army was pretty strong, and it turns out it wasn't. Turns out the Russian army is not anywhere near as strong as President Putin thought. Indeed, as the world thought. We all thought that the Russian army was much stronger than it turns out to be. It turns out it's not so strong. And that's got to make President Xi worried a little bit as well. All to say that the strong opposition, the strong fight that the Ukrainians are putting up is probably helping the Taiwanese. It's probably making it less likely that the Chinese will invade anytime soon Taiwan.
It's a very, very insightful reply, and it's good that you brought it into the broader context of what is going on in the China Taiwan situation. There's a couple more questions, and I think we'll start with this. I'll read the question. How can the West best support former Soviet Union affiliated states like Kazakhstan, Georgia, or Armenia to not give into Russian policies? They've not been accepted into the EU, and they are squeezed between China and Russia. So, reflections on that.
My reflections on that are in the first instance, what we can do to help the Georgians, the Armenians, the Kazakhs, the Moldovans. The first thing we can do is be sure the Ukrainians win. When the Ukrainians win, when the Ukrainians defeat the Russians in Ukraine, that will have an enormous effect on the Russian role in the world and the Russian status in the world. It will obviously put great pressure. It will obviously devastate the Russian military further. So that removes a large part of the threat to Kazakhstan and to Georgia. As we know, the Russians still occupy 20% of Georgia. And the Russians have had to pull troops out of South Ossetia and Abkhazia to go to fight in Ukraine because the Russians are losing and they don't have enough soldiers. So they're already pulling troops out of the occupied Georgia. They're also pulling their troops out of Nagorno-Karabakh. They're so-called peacekeeping troops out of Nagorno-Karabakh because they need these soldiers back to fight the Ukrainians, and they're so short of soldiers that they need them from all over. So that is having an effect on Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Kazakhs have to be pleased that the Russian threat is now focused on Ukraine, not focused on Kazakhstan. So I think the first thing that the West can do in answer to that question to support those former Soviet states, I don't even like to use former Soviet, we didn't even talk about that. The states that are neighboring to Russia, the thing we can do is help the Ukrainians defeat the Russians. That's the first thing. Now, the other thing, of course, we can do is encourage the Armenians to continue on the route toward a democratic Armenia. They're interested in European affiliation. The Kazakhs want to be independent of Russia. We strongly support that. The Moldovans want to be a member of the European Union. We should support that. That's obviously up to the Europeans, but we can provide that kind of support. But the biggest thing we can do to help all those nations is to help the Ukrainians defeat the Russians.
Thank you for that answer. This is kind of on a related note to the China question, just came in. It has to do with the global South. So obviously there's been some fence sitters and some notable fence sitters in the global South. So what would your advice be to Western policymakers? How do we reach out to these states and their publics and try to, in a sense, win that information battle when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
So I think the global South, as you say, has a lot at stake here. The international community broadly has a lot at stake here, but including African nations, Latin American nations, other Asian nations. There's a lot at stake in what kind of order guides the international community. If there is no order, put it this way, if there's no order, if there's no rules that nations abide by in dealing with other nations, and therefore if there are no rules against big nations, powerful nations, invading their neighbors that are smaller and less powerful, if that's okay, if that's allowed to happen, then no nation, north or south, is secure. Every nation lives next to someone who could invade them. And if that threat of invasion is allowed to persist, then no nation is secure. And so here again, to reestablish that international order that prevailed to a great degree, not perfect, but international rules-based order from the end of World War II up until 2014 when the Russians invaded, that order kept great powers from fighting each other and destroying Europe and destroying other parts of the world. That order was valuable. That order is valuable to all nations, North and South. So the reestablishment of that order is in every nation's interest. Every nation is sovereign. That's what we believe. That's what the UN believes. That's what the UN stands for. Sovereignty of nations, inviolability of borders, and all nations, North and South, who are members of the UN, believe that. They've signed up to that. And the Russians now tear that up. The Russians now disregard those rules. So my view is the order speaks for itself. The incentives are very clear. North and South, the northern nations, the southern nations, it's very clear what kind of world we want to live in. What kind of world we want to live in. What kind of world we want our kids to grow up and our grandchildren to grow up in. One like the world that was in the first half of the 20th century, with 2 world wars, with big nations invading small nations. Is that the world we want for our kids, our grandchildren? No, we'd rather have it like the second half of the 20th century, where there were rules. They were a rules-based order. That's what we'd like to see. And so in order to get that back, we need for Russia to lose.
Strong words in defense of the international rules-based order. We have 5 minutes left. There's one rather speculative, or one question that calls for quite a bit of speculation. How do you see Ukraine's NATO prospects if Ukraine manages to defeat Russia?
I would think that the NATO alliance that is designed, whose purpose is to defend NATO members against Russia, I would think that the NATO alliance would welcome Ukraine in. Ukraine, in that scenario that you just described, will have defeated Russia on the battlefield. It will have shown that its military is strong, is competent, is able to defeat Russia on the battlefield. That's the nation we want in NATO. Seems to me it will be very clear that the alliance would be much stronger. The alliance is going to be stronger with Finland in. The alliance is going to be stronger with Sweden in. the alliance is going to be stronger after the victory, after the war. And if Ukraine joins NATO, then there will be no question of another invasion by Russia of Ukraine. The Russians will not invade a NATO member. So the security guarantee that NATO provides, the Article 5 guarantee, will mean that the Russians will never again invade Ukraine, and never again cause the kind of horrible damage, killing, atrocities, genocide will never happen again. So yeah, I think the alliance would be very well advised to admit Ukraine.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. I'll now yield the floor to Leo for final reflections, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Thanks, Vila. Thank you again, Ambassador. I have nothing to add or to complement your very detailed, very passionate also defense for policies and for the principles that are at stake in helping Ukraine at this critical time. No one knows how this war is going to end, but I think many of us do understand the consequences of what would happen if the Russian aggression pays off. And I've seen it mentioned elsewhere in other meetings that I've participated in, and in a lot of international commentary, that this aggression cannot stand. And also, I'm impressed by the fact, and you've referred to it several times, so much of this is out in the open. In other conflicts, sometimes it took years for people to understand, to actually witness, in retrospect, some of the barbarous actions that took place. This is true also in the past for some excesses that Americans committed in overseas conflicts as well. But I think this is a new type of conflict where so much is so transparent to the world, and so much more will be transparent, as you have pointed out, as the Russian forces, both their organized armed forces and as we see also their mercenary forces, like the Wagner Group, as they are forced ultimately to recede. Thank you so much for your participation, for your frankness, and we will continue to pay attention to what you say, you and your colleagues, in interviews and in articles, and wish you every success in your efforts at the U.S. Institute for Peace. I'll just add that for those interested in the USIP, further information on it, we will be posting a link to one of the USIP documents. It's actually kind of their budget submission for the coming fiscal year, but it includes a very comprehensive description of what this very unique and very influential and very positive organization is doing in the world today. Thank you again, Ambassador, and thank you, Vila.
Leo, thank you very much for that. It's been a pleasure being here. Vila, it's been an honor to join you. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to Finns and others who are playing such a big role in this. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. I hope you'll join me in a warm virtual round of applause. Just really quickly, this was our final webinar before the holiday season, so I want to take the opportunity to wish everyone happy holidays. And we'll continue these discussions on US foreign and security policy in the new year. So please do stay tuned. And thank you everyone so much for coming. And the webinar is now adjourned. Thank you.